Biden with a 69% chance of winning. If you add that to Biden's tally, he goes by quite a bit here. It's going to recalculate for a second. But he goes up to 84%.
For one congressional district, that is a pretty significant increase.
Because it's that plus Arizona. I mean, maybe Biden's easiest path right now, he is ahead in Arizona. There's some question about how much more election day vote there is to be counted, but Arizona, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, then he doesn't have to worry about Pennsylvania. And that gives him a lot more options. And so those two together, we haven't called Arizona yet, but Arizona plus Nebraska.
That's the simplest way to explain it right there. Arizona plus Nebraska means you can sacrifice Pennsylvania and still have a path to 270.
Exactly.
And what more can we say? Well, can we pull up the popular vote right now? What more can we say about how what we're seeing tonight is tracking what we saw in the polls coming into tonight?
So there certainly seems to have been a miss in the polls, not as big a miss or as consequential as it was. Actually, let me take that back. There may be a miss on the scale of 2016, but because Biden had a bigger lead, he can afford to have that miss. It's also more regionally driven. He's doing fine, for example, in New Hampshire, we think, and probably in Maine. Okay in like the suburban Midwest, like Omaha, where the district is. Maybe not very well, obviously, in Florida or Texas, where polls overrating him a bit. So we're going to have, I think, questions for pollsters. But you know, the reason to have a bigger lead is because things can go wrong. You can wind up with quirky, frankly, ways to win like this.
Okay. There's a chime in another state to now project for Joe Biden, and it's going to be the state of Minnesota for Joe Biden. Joe Biden will win the state of Minnesota, and it's 10 electoral votes. It's good timing there. Picking up on what Nate was just saying, I'm going to bring this to John Carl. We know that President Trump had some hope in Minnesota. He spent a fair amount of time there, spent a fair amount of money there, because he wanted an insurance policy against the loss in Wisconsin or Michigan and Pennsylvania. It's not to be tonight. You combine that with Nebraska, and we're getting a much clearer picture of what each side has to do in these final hours.
Absolutely. I mean, he went there in the last week. He barely lost. Minnesota was the closest state that he could have flipped, and it's one of those blue wall states that he didn't get that he thought he had a chance. So now, you're looking at a situation where he really has to pick off at least Pennsylvania and maybe Pennsylvania plus Michigan or Wisconsin, depending on what happens in Arizona.
Right, and Chris Christie, this goes back to something you were saying before. It's putting even more focus on that state of Pennsylvania. Pretty much now, if Ron is right about Arizona, Joe Biden wins the state of Pennsylvania, he's going to win this election.
Yes, the ROM meter projection makes Pennsylvania. But listen, you and I have been talking about this since July. I have consistently thought that whoever wins Pennsylvania is going to be the next president of the United States, and I think it's shaping up that way now. You know, I do think encouragement for the president in Wisconsin, and I think he is going to win. I'm going to have the Christie meter. I think he's going to win North Carolina to match up with you on your Arizona prediction and make myself +4. So you're looking at really Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, that I think are still the ones that we have to watch very carefully.
And we're still waiting for Arizona, waiting for Nevada.
And by the way, George, one other thing. I'd like to pick out who the biggest loser of the night is. And so far, I think it's Mike Bloomberg. This is a guy who, decided to get into this race, thought he was going to be a factor, spent a fortune, was a blip in the Democratic Party.
Driving out of your lane to hit the guy.
And now he spent $100 million in Florida, and Trump's margin is bigger than it was before. So I think anybody who's looking for spare change, go to Mike Bloomberg. He's apparently giving it away for nothing.
See, what is it about Florida? Democrats always seem to be lured down to that state, and it never comes through at the end.
I think the changing demographics, we expect it to look more like what we're seeing in Arizona and Florida. Arizona and Texas, and it's just not trending that way when you think about black and brown voters. In part, heavy conservative vote among the Latino voters down there, the growing number of conservative seniors who are moving down and retiring there. I know Biden got a lot more of those than before, but we're just not seeing the trend lines demographically shifting with the party the way we're seeing in places like Arizona and Texas, unfortunately.
You're in Miami.
George, and one Democratic data analyst that we spoke with called what happened in Miami-Dade County a total collapse. And there are some other problems here for Democrats. There's 2 Democratic House seats that were considered safe in this election. Well, not so much anymore. And one of those belonged to Donna Shalala. And speaking to all the money spent on those television ads, well, they were brutal, just relentless. President Trump hammering Joe Biden, labeling him as a socialist. Well, only spent, according to the latest numbers that we've seen, about $80 million on those ads, while Democrats spent closer to $130 million, and those ads for Republicans really seem to resonate with those Latino groups, not just Cuban Americans, but it's clear that they also reach the Nicaraguans, the Venezuelans, the Colombians. All of those groups seem to turn out for President Trump in this election, not the way the Democrats wanted this one to go.
George, somewhat different than the way it's playing in Arizona, but David, what are we seeing in the exit polls about the role race is playing in this election?
Well, if you look at, let's take a look at the question of Minnesota racism in the U.S. It's interesting if you look here, and given the George Floyd and so much coverage of it this year and this, much needed conversation in this country, only 8% of the people, according to the exit polls, said that that is the most important problem. Of course, we are dealing with the pandemic and the economy, and so there are a lot of things that have also shared the news cycle these last few months. 61% though who thought that racism is the most important problem to address went with Joe Biden. If you look in Minnesota, performance, he was hoping to become the state, but 52% said they disapproved of Donald Trump. And again, that whole debate over containing COVID or rebuilding the economy, this was also a state where well more than 50% said we have to get a handle on the pandemic first.
Yeah, I think that what remains to be seen, with the exception of Minnesota, which we just projected, but how the racial politics are playing out, in particular in these flashpoint areas where we saw the majority of the protests and the unrest over the summer during this so-called racial reckoning, in areas like Philadelphia, where we just had the police shooting of Walter Wallace, in Minneapolis with George Floyd, in Atlanta with Rayshard Brooks, and also in Kenosha with Jacob Blake. How is that all going to shake out? 3 of those 4 states still outstanding.
Matthew, Dad, this may have been the subtext of campaigns now going back to, of course, Barack Obama's first win in 2008. We're seeing it play out in different ways every 4 years.
Yeah, and as I said, it's a shifting electoral college, and I'm very interested in seeing what the national popular vote margin ends up, because that's going to tell me a lot. My guess is what we're seeing across all the states, with the huge exception of Florida, which I think at some point the Democrats have to just say, we're never doing that again, that's it, we're done, we'll concentrate somewhere else, is there's about a 3 or 4 point shift towards Biden in every place, percentage-wise, in every place but Florida, Maine, New Hampshire, Arizona, Minnesota, all of the Texas, all of these places you're having a 3 or 4 point shift. And my guess is that is exactly what the national popular vote ends up, that there was a 3 or 4 point shift, and it gave Joe Biden we'll see, a bare win in the electoral college, and that's why everything broke the way it did.
Thank you, Matt. Byron Pitts, I know you want to weigh in on this.
George, this issue of how the George Floyd dynamic play, I'm thinking of the famous New York Broadway play, A Bronx Tale. Would you rather be loved or feared, right? What we saw with President Obama, there was so much pride and love for his candidacy in 2008. Black voters came out in large numbers. We're not seeing that this time in the South. We were at an evangelical Christian church on Sunday. Good and decent people. But when we talked about the issue of the racial divide, almost silence. They didn't have much to say about that conversation. They didn't see it the way that many people of color, many liberals have seen it around the country. And so I think for all the progress we think we're making as a nation, certainly for all the progress people pride themselves on the South, again, this notion of a new South, I think what we're seeing tonight, it would appear, when it comes to race, oftentimes in this nation, blacks and whites can receive the same information, but see it differently.
That's the story of the country. We've seen so many times we're divided in so many different ways. We have some information now coming in from the state of Nevada. The first votes are coming in from the state of Nevada. So much early vote in that state. It was well over 90% voted before election day, and now 74% of it has been counted.
That's right. That's what we have so far, George, including Clark County, this is where 3/4 of the vote's going to come for the entire state. This, of course, is Las Vegas. Joe Biden with a comfortable lead right there. He's up 10 points, overperforming from 4 years ago. A quarter of the vote still out. You can't talk about Nevada without talking about COVID, George. The state was ravaged by COVID, not only physically but also economically. At one point, it had the highest unemployment rate in the entire country. 70% of the state depends on tourism. Washoe County, this is Reno. This is where President Trump has to keep the margins close, and right now they're not that close. So the trend right now, Joe Biden on top in Nevada, and from what we're seeing with the data, a quarter of the vote still out. It looks like it could possibly be good news for Democrats.
Okay, Tatiana, thanks very much. I have to take it up.
Of election night continues.
We're back at ABC News Election Headquarters here in New York, coming up on 2 a.m. on Wednesday, November 4th. And let's take a look at the map right now, where things stand for each side here in this close race for president. Joe Biden has 220 electoral votes. 212, 13 there for Donald Trump, 23 states won for Donald Trump. Joe Biden, though, has the lead right now, 220 electoral votes. We're also keeping an eye on the Senate races right now. We can say now that Joni Ernst in the state of Iowa will win. Her Senate race will be re-elected. Republican from the state of Iowa, Katie Whitworth is there. This is an important hold for the Republicans in the state of Iowa.
Absolutely, George. And yesterday we saw Joni Ernst talk with Ivanka Trump, two voters right here in Des Moines, Iowa. Now, Joni Ernst really aligned herself with President Donald Trump, and that became incredibly important as they came up to the end of this race. Now, Joni Ernst initially was a little bit behind in some of these September polls, but as we inched toward Election Day, she started to make up some of that vote, and we really saw that, George, in these independent voters. Voters here in Iowa are known to split the ticket, but she relied on those independent voters. They turned towards her, and many of them said it was important to people here in Iowa to keep that Republican control of the Senate. So when you heard her, you heard Ivanka Trump, and you, of course, heard Governor Reynolds here encouraging voters here in Iowa to vote Republican up and down the ticket, and they certainly did that here in Iowa, and they kept control of her Senate seat, which has been incredibly important. And she was very emotional and even hoarse tonight, George, when she spoke, thanking her supporters for another chance to represent Iowans in the Senate. And of course, Teresa Greenfield, relatively unknown, but ran a very tough race, George. She campaigned some 400 stops trying to win this race, but in the end, she just couldn't pull it off. It was Senator Joni Ernst that was able to keep that seat.
Katie Whitworth, thanks very much. Sarah Fagan, Iowa, your home state. Senator Ernst is one of those Republican senators who never waver in her support of the president.
She did not, and she really fought hard for the ag industry. I mean, Donald Trump came out, did a number of positive things for the ethanol industry. I think that really helped her, and it really helped him in Iowa.
Okay, Robin Memmi, you wanted to weigh in earlier.
I think if you look at the map, this is my one chance again to repeat myself. But on a serious note, you're going to start seeing regional blocks. That when I think Nevada and Arizona, you got New Mexico, Colorado, you used to have the West Coast, you used to have the New England. You're going to start seeing that North Carolina and Georgia are going to start performing more and more like Georgia and less like Alabama, or rather more and more like Virginia and less like Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. I will say that Florida did not perform in 2018 for the Democrats. It is not performing now, and there's going to have to be a real assessment if you're going to go spend $60 million.
Plus Bloomberg's 100.
Yeah, well, I was just throwing that. Whatever you're going to go spend in Florida, my point is there's going to have to be a discussion about how you spend it, etc. Because the place is now 2-3 elections immune from what Democrats on the congressional level, the Senate level, the statewide level, and the presidential level.
That's right. Mary Bruce, I want to go to you. The Republicans are protecting a lot of those Senate seats they needed to protect tonight.
This was not what Democrats were hoping to see tonight. They still are keeping a very close eye on a few more races here. Arizona, of course, Maine, North Carolina, that runoff in Georgia. But given the optimism the Democrats had coming into this night that they were going to be able to flip the Senate and hold on to the majority, that narrative certainly appears to be changing as the night goes on. That is becoming much harder, George.
Bruce, thanks very much to see you. Any updates on the president?
George, I wish I could tell you more. I can't. We're approaching 2 a.m. We're wondering if the lights are going to stay on out here at the White House because the clock is ticking for the hour that they told us that they were going to shut these off. It's crickets from everyone on our team, from me reaching out to sources. We're not hearing anything, and that poll that was gathered to go in to see the president is now not standing outside of the White House. So, George, we wait. Sorry. Come back to me. I'll tell you more soon, I hope.
We'll find out more. I'll take that to John Carl. John, let's talk a little bit more about the Senate. Right now, you're now looking at North Carolina, 2 seats still in play right now, at least, in Georgia, and, of course, that Senate seat up in Maine.
Yeah, and the Senate seat in Maine is Susan Collins. She was considered one of the most vulnerable. She's in a very close race, but they have something called ranked choice voting in Maine, which means you vote for who you're going to vote for, and then you have a second choice. So all those people vote.
There's 4 candidates.
There's 4 candidates. So if you're voting for one of those 3rd or 4th party candidates, you might put as your second choice. Chances are that second choice is not going to be the incumbent senator if you're voting for a 3rd Party candidate. So that one we probably won't know for some time. I think the bottom line is, especially if what Governor Christie is hearing out of North Carolina is true, it's looking more and more likely that the Republicans will hang on to control of the Senate pending the expected runoffs in Georgia. We could have 2 Senate runoff races in Georgia.
We should follow up on that, and if we have anything on the board, we know that there's at least one runoff in the state of Georgia. We're still waiting to find out. Chris Christie, I know you were in contact with Senator Perdue in Georgia. The question is whether he's going to break 50.
Well, listen, George, there's 90% of the vote in now. He's at 51%. And, you know, the Perdue campaign has been telling me that it's going to be very close, and that they are hopeful that they'll avoid a runoff. They're not predicting it yet, but at 90% of the vote now, he's inching closer and closer, and we may be without a runoff. And I think if you look at it that way, Perdue looks like he may avoid it tonight.
He's running ahead of Trump, too, we should point out right now.
George is still hanging out there.